You ever notice how the quiet old guys are always the ones nobody should mess with? The voice rolled through the crowded supply tent with the easy arrogance of a man who had never truly been tested. Laughter followed immediately after, sharp and casual beneath the endless hum of portable generators outside. The massive canvas walls trembled softly as desert wind pushed against them, carrying the dry smell of dust, diesel fuel, and jet exhaust through Camp Ridgeline Naval Station somewhere deep in Southern California. Crates were stacked shoulder-high across the tent, marked with shipping codes, deployment tags, and faded military stencils. Young Navy SEAL operators moved between them with quick, confident strides, their rifles slung low, their uniforms still crisp from morning inspection. Near the far end of the tent, standing completely alone beside an old supply crate, was Walter Hayes, 84 years old, thin shoulders beneath a faded olive jacket, white hair tucked under a weathered ball cap with no insignia on it. One hand rested lightly against the wooden crate as if he recognized it better than the people surrounding him. He didn't seem lost. He seemed somewhere else entirely. Tyler Brooks noticed him the moment he walked in. 27 years old, broad shoulders, clean jawline. Every movement carried the restless confidence of an elite operator who had spent most of his adult life being told he belonged among the best. He slowed near the old man, glancing toward the others with a smirk already forming. "Hey, Grandpa," Tyler called out. "You looking for bingo night or something?" A few SEALs chuckled while continuing to unpack equipment cases nearby. Walter didn't answer. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the crate in front of him. Tyler exchanged a grin with another operator and stepped closer. "Seriously," he said, "you lost. Still nothing." The old man's silence somehow made the laughter weaker instead of stronger. Tyler frowned slightly, irritated by the lack of reaction. Most civilians got nervous around SEAL teams. Most people tried too hard to explain themselves. But this old man just stood there quietly while the noise of the tent swirled around him. Outside, the distant thump of helicopter rotors rolled across the airfield. Somewhere beyond the canvas walls, a forklift beeped in reverse. Walter's eyes shifted almost invisibly toward the sound before settling back onto the crate. Tyler folded his arms. "All right then," he said louder. "Which war did you even serve in?" The tent answered with another round of laughter, louder this time. Someone muttered, "Probably the Revolutionary War." Another operator snorted into his coffee. Walter finally looked up, slowly, calmly. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected faintly in eyes that didn't seem old at all. They looked cold, not angry, just distant, measured, like a man silently calculating exits in a room nobody else realized could become dangerous. Tyler's grin faded a little beneath that stare. Walter studied him for a moment before speaking in a low, gravel-lined voice worn smooth by time. "The one your government buried." Silence didn't arrive all at once. It spread gradually through the tent like a pressure change before a storm. A nearby sailor stopped dragging a crate. One of the younger operators glanced sideways, unsure whether to laugh again. Tyler let out a short scoff. "Okay," he said. "So now we got conspiracy theories." A couple of the others laughed nervously. Walter looked back toward the crate. The faded stencil across its side barely remained visible beneath decades of scratches and worn paint. Most people would never have noticed it. But his fingers brushed lightly against the letters as though touching something sacred. Tyler stepped closer and squinted at the markings. "What even is this thing?" he muttered. Dust clung to the old black paint. Half the letters had nearly disappeared with age, but one line still remained visible beneath the supply code. "Ghost Company, 1968. Tyler smirked again. "Sounds fake as hell." Walter's hand froze against the wood. For the first time since entering the tent, something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, not anger, memory. Outside, a helicopter passed low over the base, its rotor wash rattling the canvas overhead like distant thunder. The laughter inside the supply tent faded unevenly, like men suddenly realizing a joke had gone too far without understanding exactly why. Tyler Brooks kept his smirk in place, but something about the old man's stillness was beginning to irritate him in ways he could not explain. Most civilians either puffed themselves up or backed down once pressure landed on them. Walter Hayes did neither. He simply rested one weathered hand against the crate marked Ghost Company, 1968, while the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed softly above him. The desert wind outside picked up again, rattling the tent canvas hard enough to make the hanging light fixtures sway. Somewhere beyond the motor pool, a jet engine screamed to life across the runway. Tyler shook his head and glanced toward the others. "You hear this guy?" he asked. "Government buried his war." One of the younger operators laughed awkwardly while stuffing magazines into a gear case. "Maybe he was some secret ninja in Cambodia," another added. "Or maybe Area 51. A few chuckles followed, thinner now. Walter ignored all of them. His eyes remained fixed on the faded stencil beneath his fingertips. The old black lettering looked ancient against the scarred wood, almost erased by time. Yet he traced the words carefully, like someone reading names on a gravestone. Tyler noticed it immediately. "You know what this is?" he asked. Walter answered without looking up. "I used to load these crates myself." Tyler scoffed. "Sure you did." He stepped beside the crate and brushed dust away with the side of his hand. More lettering emerged beneath the grime. Half of it had faded beyond recognition, but one line remained visible enough to read. "Classified transit authorization." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Well, that sounds dramatic." Walter's expression did not change. Everything was dramatic back then. The answer landed strangely. Calm. Matter of fact. Not boastful. Not defensive. Tyler folded his arms tighter across his chest. He had spent years around men who exaggerated combat stories after 2 beers and an audience. Walter Hayes did not sound like those men. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Near the center aisle of the tent, Chief Petty Officer Miguel Ramirez finally looked up from the clipboard in his hands. He had been supervising inventory counts for almost an hour while half listening to the exchange. At 53 years old, Ramirez had spent too much time around veterans to ignore instinct when it started talking. And right now instinct was screaming. He studied Walter quietly from across the tent. The old man stood relaxed, but not careless. Weight balanced evenly. Eyes moving without seeming to move at all. Every entrance. Every exit. Every reflection in the polished metal shelving nearby. Ramirez had seen young operators do that after deployments. Men who spent years training themselves never to sit with their backs exposed. Walter was doing it unconsciously. Tyler grabbed the edge of the crate and leaned against it casually. "So what now?" he asked. "You going to tell us you were some ghost operator nobody ever heard of?" Walter finally looked directly at him again. The pale blue in his eyes seemed almost colorless beneath the harsh lights. "Nobody was supposed to hear about us." The tent grew quieter. Even the sailors near the rear tables had slowed their movements enough to listen. Tyler forced out another laugh. "Right." But his confidence sounded thinner this time. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his faded jacket and removed something small wrapped in worn canvas cloth. He unfolded it carefully with old, steady hands. Inside rested a pair of tarnished military dog tags attached to a broken chain. The metal surfaces were scratched nearly smooth with age. Tyler leaned closer automatically. "Those real?" Walter glanced down at the tags for a long moment before answering. "They are all that came home." The words settled heavily into the air between the shelves and supply crates. No dramatic tone. No speech. Just simple truth delivered quietly enough to force everyone else to lean in. Ramirez felt a cold sensation move down his spine. Because suddenly the old man's face looked familiar. Not personally familiar. Historically familiar. Like a photograph glimpsed once inside a briefing room years ago under fluorescent Pentagon lights beside words nobody was supposed to repeat outside secure walls. Outside the tent, another helicopter passed overhead. The deep, rhythmic pulse of its rotors rolled across the base. And for the briefest moment, Walter Hayes closed his eyes as if hearing voices buried somewhere inside the sound. The sound of the helicopter faded slowly into the desert sky. But Walter Hayes remained perfectly still beside the crate, as though part of him was still listening to it disappear. The supply tent had changed without anyone openly acknowledging it. The earlier laughter was gone now, replaced by the uneasy silence that settles over people when confidence begins slipping through their fingers. Tyler Brooks hated that feeling. He straightened his posture and forced a grin back onto his face, refusing to let an 84-year-old stranger control the room without even trying. "All right," he said, nodding toward the dog tags in Walter's hand. "Where exactly did those come from?" Walter looked down at the tags resting against his palm. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected weakly off the worn metal edges. "Danong," he answered quietly. 1968. Tyler shrugged. My grandfather was in Vietnam too. Walter gave a faint nod. A lot of good men were. The answer carried no challenge in it. No competition, no bitterness. Somehow that made Tyler even more irritated. One of the younger operators leaned against a stack of supply cases nearby. Ghost company, he muttered with a smirk. Sounds like something out of a movie. A few nervous chuckles followed, but they died quickly when Walter's eyes lifted toward him. Not angry eyes. Worse, tired eyes. The kind that had already seen every version of arrogance a young man could invent. Walter folded the dog tags carefully back into the cloth wrap before sliding them into his jacket pocket. Movies always get it wrong, he said. The desert wind struck the tent harder this time, making the hanging light fixtures sway above them. Canvas snapped sharply overhead. Somewhere outside, a forklift operator shouted directions over the grinding noise of diesel engines. The base remained alive with movement, but inside the tent the atmosphere had tightened into something smaller and heavier. Chief. Ramirez walked slowly toward the far inventory table without taking his eyes off Walter Hayes. His heartbeat had picked up in a way he had not felt in years. He remembered sitting through classified operational history briefings during a joint command assignment back in Virginia. Most of it had been forgotten before he even left the room. But one detail stayed buried in his memory because of how strange it sounded. Ghost Company. Unofficial reconnaissance unit. Personnel records incomplete. Mission archives sealed. Casualty reports inconsistent. Ramirez stopped beside an open laptop at the inventory station and pretended to check shipment numbers while quietly studying Walter's face again. The old man stood with the same calm posture. Hands steady, eyes observant. Nothing about him asked for attention. Yet somehow the entire tent revolved around him now. Tyler noticed Ramirez watching and smirked. Come on, Chief, he called out. You are not buying this Secret War stuff too. Ramirez ignored him. His gaze dropped toward the old crate again. Beneath the faded stencil, another marking had become visible where dust had been brushed away. A small black insignia, nearly worn flat by time. Ramirez felt the breath catch slightly in his chest. He knew that symbol, or at least he had seen it once before inside a secure slideshow presentation almost 20 years ago. A black circle surrounding a single white star. No unit designation. No branch identifier. Just the star. Walter noticed where Ramirez was looking. For the first time, the old man's expression changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. Ramirez stepped closer carefully. Sir, he said quietly. Where did you get this crate? Tyler rolled his eyes immediately. Chief, seriously? But Ramirez barely heard him anymore. Walter looked at the insignia for a long moment before answering. It came back before we did. The words settled into the silence like falling concrete. Ramirez stared at him, then at the symbol again. A cold realization spread slowly across his face. Because suddenly he remembered the final line from that old classified briefing. Ghost Company was never officially disbanded because according to the records, Ghost Company never officially existed. For several long seconds, nobody inside the supply tent moved. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while desert wind pressed against the heavy canvas walls with a dry, restless hiss. Tyler Brooks shifted his weight uncomfortably and glanced around at the others, searching for someone willing to break the tension with another joke. Nobody did. Chief Ramirez kept staring at the faded insignia on the crate like he had just uncovered a ghost buried beneath decades of dust. Walter Hayes remained motionless beside it, one weathered hand resting lightly against the scarred wood. The old man looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically. Something deeper than that. Like memory itself carried weight. Tyler finally forced out a scoff. Okay, enough mystery movie stuff. He pointed toward the crate. You seriously expect us to believe this was some secret unit nobody ever heard about? Walter's eyes lifted slowly toward him. You were not supposed to hear about us. The answer came so calmly that it unsettled the room all over again. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but another sound interrupted him. A radio crackled somewhere outside the tent, followed by the distant rumble of helicopter rotors crossing low over the airfield. Walter's expression changed instantly. It was subtle. Most people would not have noticed it. But Ramirez did. The old man's shoulders stiffened slightly. His eyes unfocused for half a heartbeat. Then the supply tent disappeared from his mind completely. Suddenly, he was no longer standing beneath fluorescent lights in Southern California. The The smell of diesel fuel vanished beneath the thick, wet scent of jungle rain and burned aviation oil. Rotor blades thundered overhead through low-hanging clouds while heat and humidity wrapped around everything like a suffocating blanket. Walter was 26 years old again, crouched knee-deep in mud beside a shattered supply crate almost identical to the one in front of him now. Red emergency lights pulsed through the darkness while exhausted men moved through drifting smoke with radios pressed tightly against their ears. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. Nobody wasted motion. Somewhere beyond the trees, distant gunfire echoed across the valley, sharp and uneven beneath the constant mechanical rhythm of helicopter rotors circling overhead. A young radio operator beside Walter kept repeating the same phrase into his headset with increasing desperation. Ghost Company is off the grid. Repeat. Ghost Company is off the grid. Walter remembered the weight of wet jungle air in his lungs, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the metallic taste of fear nobody ever admitted out loud. He remembered looking down at the black circle insignia painted on the crate while rainwater streamed across the wood grain like dark blood. Then another voice crackled through the static. Calm. Steady. Burn the records. The memory vanished instantly. Walter blinked once beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the supply tent. The helicopter noise outside faded back into the distance. Tyler was still standing there watching him carefully now. The younger man's expression had changed. The arrogance remained, but uncertainty had begun creeping in around the edges. Walter slowly removed his hand from the crate. Some things were never meant to come home, he said quietly. Nobody answered. Ramirez felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck, because that phrase triggered something else buried deep inside his memory. Another line from that classified briefing years ago. Operational losses unconfirmed. Personnel records sealed by direct executive authority. Remaining materials transferred under restricted archive control. Ramirez suddenly understood why the crate was here, why it looked untouched for decades, and why Walter Hayes had walked into this tent like a man searching for a grave nobody else could see. Tyler folded his arms tighter. If all this is real, he said carefully, then why have none of us ever heard about Ghost Company? Walter looked toward the tent entrance where hot desert sunlight cut through the canvas opening in sharp white beams. Dust floated through the air like smoke. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Because the men who survived were told to forget. The words settled into the silence with a weight that no one inside the tent knew how to answer. The silence inside the supply tent no longer felt awkward. It felt heavy, like everyone standing there had unknowingly stepped into a room that belonged to someone else long before they arrived. Tyler Brooks shifted his jaw uneasily while watching Walter Hayes stare toward the bright opening of the tent. Outside, sunlight bounced harshly off rows of parked Humvees and supply trucks lined across the base motor pool. Heat shimmered above the asphalt in restless waves. Sailors moved in the distance, carrying gear toward loading zones while helicopters drifted low over the airfield like dark insects against the white California sky. Yet inside the tent, nobody seemed interested in deployment prep anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the old man beside the crate marked Ghost Company, 1968. Chief Ramirez finally stepped closer. Slowly, carefully, like approaching something unstable. Sir, he said quietly. Who exactly were you attached to? Walter did not answer right away. His weathered face remained calm beneath the fluorescent lights, but his eyes carried that same distant look again. Ramirez had seen it before in old combat veterans at military hospitals. Men whose minds sometimes drifted backward without warning. Men who never fully came home. Walter's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the crate. Nobody, he said at last. Officially. Tyler exhaled sharply through his nose. There it is again. He shook his head. Everything is classified. Everything is secret. Convenient. But the confidence behind his sarcasm sounded weaker now. Even he could hear it. Walter glanced toward him. You think history tells the whole story because somebody printed it in a textbook. Tyler folded his arms tighter. And you think nobody can question you because you are old. The words hung sharply in the air. A few operators exchanged uncomfortable looks nearby. Ramirez immediately sensed the tension turning dangerous in a way Tyler did not understand yet. Walter simply nodded once. Fair enough. The answer caught Tyler off guard. No anger. No lecture. Just quiet acceptance. that somehow made the younger man feel smaller instead of bigger. Walter slowly reached into his jacket pocket again and removed a folded piece of paper so old the edges looked brittle beneath the fluorescent lights. He unfolded it carefully across the crate top. Tyler leaned forward despite himself. It was a photograph, black and white, faded nearly beyond recognition. 6 young soldiers stood beside a helicopter somewhere deep in jungle terrain. Mud covered their boots. Rain streaked across the camera lens. Most of the faces were too blurred to distinguish clearly, except one, younger, harder, eyes sharp beneath the brim of a soaked boonie hat. Walter Hayes. Tyler stared at the picture silently. One of the operators beside him muttered under his breath, "That is really him." Walter pointed toward the helicopter in the background. A black circle with a white star had been painted beneath the cockpit window. The same insignia from the crate. The same symbol Ramirez recognized from classified archives. "That bird never officially flew," Walter said quietly. "Those men never officially deployed. And 4 of them never officially died." The supply tent became completely still. Even the constant movement outside seemed farther away now. Ramirez felt his pulse quicken, because suddenly he understood something else. This was not stolen valor. This was the opposite. Walter Hayes had spent decades carrying a history nobody had been allowed to acknowledge. Tyler swallowed once before speaking again. "Then why are you here now?" Walter looked down at the old photograph resting against the crate. For a moment, the hard military calm slipped from his face, revealing something older and sadder beneath it. "Because this crate was supposed to disappear," he said. But somebody finally stopped hiding it. The desert wind struck the tent again, harder than before. The hanging lights swayed softly overhead, while loose papers fluttered across a nearby supply table. Walter carefully folded the photograph and slid it back into his pocket. Then his eyes lifted toward Ramirez for the first time with clear recognition. "You remember the briefing, Chief?" It was not a question. Ramirez felt his stomach tighten instantly. Because he did. Remember. Not all of it. Just enough to know nobody outside secure command channels should have known he had ever seen those files. Chief Ramirez felt every pair of eyes inside the supply tent shift toward him at once. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly while hot desert wind rattled the canvas walls hard enough to make dust drift down from the support beams. Somewhere outside, sailors shouted inventory numbers across the loading yard, but the noise sounded distant now. Tyler Brooks stared between Ramirez and Walter Hayes with growing confusion. "Briefing?" Tyler asked. "What briefing?" Ramirez did not answer immediately. His face had gone pale beneath the harsh white lighting. Walter watched him quietly from beside the crate, one hand still resting against the faded wood as though grounding himself in something only he could feel. Ramirez swallowed once before speaking carefully. "About 15 years ago," he said slowly, "I was attached to Joint Special Operations Command during a communications systems upgrade." Tyler frowned. "Okay." Ramirez barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the black circle insignia painted beneath the stencil markings. Part of the clearance process involved exposure to restricted historical files. Walter gave the faintest nod. Ramirez continued. "Most of it was heavily redacted. Names blacked out. Operations removed entirely. But I remember that symbol." Tyler looked back toward the crate again, then at Walter. "You are serious?" Nobody answered him. The silence itself became the answer. Walter slowly walked toward a nearby folding table cluttered with manifests and shipping paperwork. His movements remained steady despite his age, deliberate in the way only lifelong military men moved. He picked up a small metal thermos sitting near the edge of the table and unscrewed the cap. Steam no longer rose from it. The coffee inside had probably gone cold hours ago. Walter took a slow sip anyway. Tyler noticed something strange then. The old man's hands never shook. Not even slightly. "Those files," Ramirez said quietly. "They mentioned a reconnaissance element operating outside official command structures during the late 1960s. Walter stared into the thermos for a moment before speaking. "Unofficial men for unofficial wars." Tyler let out a short breath through his nose. "That does not even sound real." Walter looked toward him calmly. That was the point. Outside the tent entrance, a pair of junior sailors walked past, carrying radio equipment cases toward the communications building. One of them glanced inside the supply tent briefly before continuing on. Life across the base moved normally. Trucks rolled by. Helicopters lifted into the bright California sky. Yet inside the tent it felt like time itself had slowed down around Walter Hayes. Ramirez stepped closer. The briefing said most operational records were destroyed after extraction failures near the Cambodian border. Tyler blinked. Cambodia? Walter remained silent for several long seconds. Then he nodded once. Some borders only existed on maps. The words landed with quiet weight. Tyler rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. Everything about this conversation felt wrong now. Not fake. Worse than fake. Hidden. Like standing too close to something people with stars on their collars never wanted discussed out loud. Walter set the thermos down gently. You know what the hardest part was? He asked quietly. Nobody answered. Walter looked toward the bright slit of sunlight cutting through the tent entrance. Dust drifted through the beam like smoke. Coming home and pretending none of it happened. His voice remained calm, but something underneath it had changed. Not anger. Exhaustion. The kind carried for decades without complaint. Ramirez felt it immediately. Tyler did too, though he would never admit it aloud. Walter reached into his jacket pocket again and removed one of the tarnished dog tags from the cloth wrap. He held it carefully between two fingers. Most men get parades, he said softly. We got silence. The supply tent seemed to grow smaller around those words. One of the younger operators nearby quietly removed his sunglasses without realizing he had done it. Another stopped pretending to sort ammunition boxes and simply listened. Tyler looked down at the dog tag in Walter's hand. Whose was that? Walter studied the scratched metal surface for a long moment. Radio operator named Danny Mercer. His eyes drifted somewhere far beyond the tent walls again. 19 years old. Could play guitar better than anybody I ever met. Tyler lowered his gaze slightly. For the first time since the old man walked into the tent, he no longer looked irritated. He looked ashamed. Tyler Brooks could not stop looking at the dog tag in Walter Hayes' hand. The old scratched metal seemed impossibly small compared to the weight it carried inside the supply tent. Around them, conversations across the base continued like normal life had refused to notice something extraordinary unfolding beneath the canvas roof. Engines rumbled outside. Forklifts moved cargo across the loading yard. Helicopters crossed low through the bright afternoon sky. But inside the tent, nobody touched the supply crates anymore. Nobody joked. Walter carefully wrapped the dog tag back inside the worn cloth and slipped it into his jacket pocket with slow, deliberate movements. Chief Ramirez remained silent for several long seconds before finally speaking again. Sir, he said carefully, if Ghost Company was erased, then how did this crate end up here? Walter's eyes drifted back toward the faded stencil on the wood. Because somebody forgot to finish the job. Tyler frowned slightly. What does that mean? Walter looked toward him calmly. It means records disappear easier than equipment. The answer settled heavily over the room. Ramirez immediately understood what Walter meant. Bureaucracies buried paperwork all the time. But physical objects survived. Crates. Tags. Flight manifests. Forgotten storage inventories buried inside military warehouses for decades until someone accidentally moved the wrong pallet. Tyler rubbed his jaw slowly. His earlier arrogance had almost vanished now, replaced by the uneasy curiosity of a man realizing the world might be larger and darker than he had assumed. Walter stepped closer to the crate again and brushed dust away from the lower corner with the sleeve of his jacket. Another marking appeared beneath the grime. A faded shipping label stamped with black military. Lettering nearly impossible to read. Ramirez leaned closer instinctively. Walter traced the letters lightly with one finger. Subic Bay, he murmured. 1971. Ramirez felt his stomach tighten. The Philippines transfer ports. Overseas storage routes. Restricted military archive movement. Suddenly the timeline started fitting together in his mind with terrifying precision. Tyler looked between them. Okay, somebody explain what is happening. Before either man could answer, Ramirez's radio crackled sharply at his belt. The sudden noise made several operators flinch. Ramirez grabbed it immediately. Chief Ramirez. Static hissed through the speaker for a moment before a voice answered. Ramirez, this is Commander Lewis from Logistics Control. I need confirmation on a restricted inventory flag that just triggered in your sector. Ramirez exchanged a quick glance with Walter. What kind of flag? Another pause. Papers shuffled faintly through the radio. Old archival material connected to special operations records. Apparently, someone scanned a transfer code tied to a sealed shipment. Tyler's face changed instantly. He looked toward the crate. Ramirez lowered his voice carefully. And what did the system do? The answer came immediately. It kicked the request straight to Washington. The entire tent went silent again. Even the sailors near the entrance stopped moving. Tyler stared at Ramirez. Washington. Ramirez did not respond right away. His eyes remained locked on Walter Hayes. The old man looked neither surprised nor nervous. If anything, he looked tired, like a man watching an old storm finally arrive after spending decades outrunning it. Commander Lewis's voice returned through the radio, tighter now. Ramirez, I need to know exactly who is standing near that crate. Ramirez hesitated. Every instinct told him to choose his next words carefully. Walter saved him from making the decision. Tell him Walter Hayes is here. Ramirez slowly lifted the radio again. Commander, he said quietly. The individual identifies himself as Walter Hayes. Silence answered him for nearly 3 full seconds. Then the voice on the other end changed completely. Gone was the casual logistics tone. What returned sounded controlled. Alarmed. Do not let him leave. Tyler felt the air leave his lungs slightly. Ramirez narrowed his eyes. Sir. The radio crackled again. Repeat. Walter Hayes is not to leave that tent. Senior command is already inbound. Every operator inside the supply tent looked toward Walter at once. The old veteran simply stared toward the bright slit of sunlight outside the tent entrance, while helicopter rotors echoed faintly somewhere high above the base. Then he spoke in the same quiet, gravel-lined voice. Took them long enough. The atmosphere inside the supply tent changed completely after the radio call. Nobody spoke above a whisper anymore. The young operators who had laughed earlier now stood scattered between the crates in uneasy silence, watching Walter Hayes with the same cautious respect soldiers reserve for unexploded ordnance. Outside, the base remained alive with noise and motion. Diesel engines growled across the loading yard. Helicopters crossed overhead in slow sweeping patterns. Heat shimmered above the asphalt beneath the brutal California sun. Yet inside the tent, time seemed to tighten around the old man standing beside the faded Ghost Company crate. Tyler Brooks glanced toward Chief Ramirez. Senior Command? He asked quietly. For him. Ramirez did not answer immediately. He was still staring at the radio clipped to his vest as though expecting it to crackle again at any second. Walter looked strangely unsurprised. He rested both hands lightly against the crate now, his pale blue eyes fixed on the faded insignia beneath the dust. The black circle surrounding the white star looked almost ghost-like beneath the fluorescent lights overhead. Tyler swallowed once before stepping closer. His voice had lost nearly all its arrogance now. Who were you people? Walter remained silent for several seconds. The desert wind rattled the canvas walls again, while loose paperwork fluttered across a nearby folding table. Finally, the old veteran answered without looking up. The men nobody could admit existed. Tyler felt a chill crawl slowly along his arms despite the heat inside the tent. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles rolled across the motor pool outside. Tires crunched sharply over gravel. Doors slammed. Then came another sound that changed the entire mood of the room instantly. Boots. Fast. Purposeful. Multiple sets approaching the tent entranced together. Every active duty sailor inside straightened automatically. Ramirez turned toward the entrance, just as 2 naval security officers stepped through the canvas opening, followed immediately by a tall man in desert utilities with silver stars on his collar. Rear Admiral Thomas Keller. The entire tent snapped to attention instinctively. Tyler's stomach dropped. Rear Admirals did not appear personally for supply inventory issues. Keller ignored everyone else completely. His eyes locked onto Walter Hayes the moment he entered the tent. For one brief second, the Admiral's expression shifted into something Tyler had never expected to see on a man of that rank. Shock. Real shock. Walter slowly turned toward him. Neither man spoke at first. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while helicopter rotors echoed faintly across the distant airfield. Then Admiral Keller crossed the tent floor in quick, deliberate strides until he stopped directly in front of Walter Hayes. Every person inside the tent watched breathlessly. Tyler expected questions, orders, demands for identification. Instead, the Admiral stood perfectly still before the old veteran and saluted. The motion was sharp, immediate, absolute. The supply tent froze. Tyler felt his pulse hammer against his ribs. Several younger operators exchanged stunned looks, while sailors near the entrance stared openly in disbelief. Rear Admiral Keller held the salute for several long seconds before lowering his hand slowly. His voice, when it came, sounded quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Sir," he said carefully, "we thought you were gone." Walter studied the Admiral's face for a moment before answering. "Almost was." Keller nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly. "Washington notified us the second that archive code activated." He glanced toward the Ghost Company crate beside Walter. "We have been trying to locate that shipment for 38 years. Tyler stared between them speechlessly. Admiral Keller finally looked toward the younger operators surrounding the tent. His eyes hardened instantly. "Does anyone here understand who this man is?" Nobody answered. Walter saved them again. "No," he said quietly. "And that is probably for the best." Keller looked back toward him with unmistakable respect in his expression now. Not ceremonial respect, personal respect. The kind earned long before rank ever enters the conversation. The Admiral lowered his voice further. "Sir, there are people at the Pentagon who are going to want to speak with you immediately." Walter glanced toward the bright sunlight outside the tent entrance. Dust drifted through the hot afternoon air, while another helicopter crossed low over the base in the distance. His answer came calm and steady. "I did not come here for Washington." Then he rested one hand gently against the old crate again. "I came for my men." No one inside the supply tent moved after Walter Hayes spoke those final words. "I came for my men." The sentence settled across the room with more weight than any order Rear Admiral Keller could have given. Outside, the late afternoon sun burned low across the base, turning the distant rows of helicopters gold beneath the California heat haze. Rotor blades chopped steadily through the air somewhere beyond the motor pool, while diesel engines rumbled across the loading yard. Life continued normally outside the canvas walls. But inside the tent, every person understood they were standing in the middle of something history had almost erased. Admiral Keller slowly lowered his gaze toward the faded Ghost Company crate beside Walter. The hardened expression of command remained on his face, but there was grief there too now. Old grief. The kind men carried quietly for decades. "We searched for the surviving records for years," Keller said softly. "Most of us believed there was nothing left." Walter brushed his fingers lightly across the weathered wood. There was enough left. Tyler Brooks stood near the rear supply shelves without speaking. The young Navy SEAL barely recognized himself compared to the man who had mocked Walter only an hour earlier. The arrogance was gone now, stripped away piece by piece beneath truths he never imagined existed. He watched the old veteran carefully as Walter reached down toward the crate latch. His movements remained steady despite his age. Calm, respectful, almost ceremonial. The metal latch groaned softly when Walter opened it. Dust rose into the fluorescent light overhead, while every person inside the tent unconsciously leaned closer. Inside the crate rested several smaller canvas-wrapped bundles stacked with impossible care. Time had stained the fabric dark brown around the edges, but each bundle remained tied neatly with faded military cord. Walter stared at them silently for several seconds before reaching down and lifting the top bundle into his hands. His fingers trembled for the first time since entering the tent. Only slightly. Admiral Keller removed his cover quietly beneath the fluorescent lights. Chief Ramirez followed immediately. One by one, every active-duty sailor and operator inside the tent did the same without being told. Tyler swallowed hard before removing his own cap. Walter slowly untied the cord around the bundle. Inside rested 4 tarnished sets of military dog tags wrapped carefully beside a folded American flag no bigger than a paperback book. The entire supply tent fell completely silent. Even the noise outside seemed distant now. Walter looked down at the names etched into the worn metal tags. Danny Mercer, Samuel Pike, Leonard Grady, Thomas Keene. Men frozen forever at 19, 21, 24 years old. Men whose families probably never learned the truth about where they disappeared. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. "I promised I would bring them home," he said quietly. No one spoke. Admiral Keller's eyes lowered respectfully toward the dog tags in Walter's hands. Tyler felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Because for the first time in his military career, He understood the difference between serving for recognition and serving because someone had to. Walter carefully folded the small flag again before placing it back inside the crate beside the tags. Then he closed the lid gently with both hands. No dramatic speech followed. No applause. Just silence. The kind of silence soldiers understand better than civilians ever could. Walter reached for his old jacket and adjusted it slowly before turning toward the tent entrance. Sunlight poured through the opening in long golden beams filled with drifting dust. Admiral Keller stepped aside immediately to clear his path. So did everyone else. Tyler watched the old veteran walk past him toward the exit, the same quiet man they had laughed at only hours earlier. But now nobody could look away from him. Right before Walter stepped out into the sunlight, Tyler spoke quietly behind him. "Sir." Walter paused without turning around. Tyler's throat tightened slightly. "I am sorry." Walter stood there for a moment while helicopter rotors echoed softly across the base beyond the tent walls. Then he gave the faintest nod. "Just remember them," he said. And with that, Walter Hayes walked out into the fading California sunlight carrying nothing except an old jacket, a lifetime of silence, and the memory of men history was never supposed to remember. Some wars ended on paper. Others simply faded into quiet men who learned to carry them alone.